Okay, hi, beautiful people. Miss Cortez here, coming to you from afar. I am out of town today, so I am recording this in advance. I am so sorry that we can't be together live because this is one of my favorite lessons that we're going to be talking about today. And yeah, I'm sad that I can't be there with you because um, I love this lesson. Anyways, I'm gonna pause really fast and move so that I'm not having this glare. Hang on. Okay, that's only slightly better, but it's like 10:30 at night on Thursday, and I'm in my living room, so it is what it is. All right, when we were last together, which for me was just yesterday, but for you was Wednesday, we were talking about perception, and we finished up our notes on perception, and then you guys had a written task to write a summary about self-concept, and you had 4 questions that I asked you guys to answer about self-concept, and essentially how do you define self-concept, or like what do you consider part of your self-concept, how did you develop your self-concept, and then how does like social media and the internet affect our self-concept and our self-esteem and whatnot. And hopefully you accessed the articles that I also posted along with this task, and I imagine most of you utilized those resources and started to understand that like our idea of who we are is complex. It is affected by a lot of things. If we have a lot of negative um, feedback in our lives, then that has a really big impact on us. And if we develop a low self-esteem, that can really have a big impact on us. So remember, the whole point of understanding perception is, number one, I want you guys to have a balanced self-concept. I want you to recognize your strengths and weaknesses and have that positive self-talk. Number two, I want you to have a high self-esteem. Balanced self-concept, which is our total beliefs and attitudes about ourselves. And then we want to have a high amount of satisfaction with that. And that doesn't mean that we don't ever grow or change, or like, of course we do all of those things. But the whole point is to have a more accurate perception, because, and here's how it applies to the way in which we communicate with other people. If you have an inaccurate perception of yourself, you are not as capable of perceiving other people accurately. So you're going to have an inaccurate perception of other people as well. So we want to have an accurate perception of ourselves, and that way we can have a more accurate perception of other people and other events and other things in our lives. It makes us better critical thinkers too, because we start to recognize those complexities. We start to have humility and grace for other people. And that's really important in our communication. We don't want to be negative Nancy's. We want to have positive self-talk. We want to have an accurate perception, a balanced self-concept, and a high self-esteem. So now we're going to take this sort of the next level. So now we've learned a little bit about who we are as communicators. And now we're going to think about, okay, how do our perceptions affect kind of the bigger picture? Because now we're in this society, we have to interact with each other. And that is even more complex, right? We have these big ideas. So today we are going to start a little critical thinking analysis of something that's really, really important. And this is really core to most people in the United States and a lot of people around the world. And that is free speech. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and these slides will also be available for you, on Google Classroom and ManageBack. But we're going to take a little walk through the idea of free speech. And this is so, so important. and even more so now because a lot of people are exercising their free speech, and there's a lot of confusion about what that means and what's okay and what's not okay, and how we all exist in this marketplace of ideas together in this messiness of free speech, especially in the United States, and especially in an election year, and especially with a crazy pandemic and social unrest and a lot of emotional weight and issues that people are carrying with them. So let's take a look at the complexities of free speech, because it is really, really complex. So first I want you to just take a moment and I want you to think about this question on the screen. What does free speech mean to you? And if we were in class, I would ask you guys to share. I might be able to develop like a little Padlet or something so that you guys can share some thoughts and whatnot before I post this video on Monday, but I haven't done that yet, so I apologize for that. But just think to yourself, like, what does free speech mean to you? All right, let's move on to the next slide, because it is really complicated. So a lot of people, their gut reaction kind of goes to this question of, I can say whatever I want, right? So that is kind of an interesting question to ponder. Can I say whatever I want? So every country is a little bit different, but the majority of developed nations have a form of free speech that doesn't really have a lot of limits. So free speech in the United States is a constitutionally protected right. But again, like, not everybody really knows what that means, okay? And what happens when you cross the line between what some people perceive as free speech and what other people might consider unethical speech? So we have a lot of questions to really ponder today. And I'm sorry to tell you, I'm not going to be able to provide you with a lot of answers, because the reality of it is very complex. And in some ways, you do have a lot of leeway in what you can communicate and how you express yourself in the United States. That is a really important core value that we obviously put into a founding document of our country, but it's also something that culturally and socially we really value. But because of that, there's a lot of confusion, and we don't always really know what that means. So let's try to break this down and get a little bit of clarity, okay? So let's first look at the broader term of free speech and how that is really perceived in a broad spectrum here in the United States and a lot of developed nations. So this is just a little quote from the First Amendment. It's just a portion of it. It says, "The right of people to express their opinions publicly without governmental interference, subject to the laws against libel, incitement to violence, or rebellion." So I want you to think about that a little bit, because these are definitely some guiding ideas that help us frame our understanding of free speech. So first, we're going to talk about protected speech. So the big, broad idea of free speech within the context of the United States is, yeah, you pretty much can say whatever you want. There are some limitations. So we have a document written into the governing body of our government, you know, within our Bill of Rights and within our Constitution. And a lot of countries have constitutions. And a lot of countries even speak directly to this idea of free expression or something like that. And so because of that, the government and then later the Supreme Court really had to define kind of, what does that mean? What does that look like? What is allowed? What is protected? Okay, what is okay? And so they put specific things in the document that they're like, okay, we really want to be clear about this. Protesting in the United States is considered protected speech. Okay, voting in the United States is considered protected speech. Writing things is protected. Involvement in the community, like being part of your, city council and, your community organizations. And yes, expressing yourself without filters is protected within the auspices of the Constitution. And that also includes being insensitive and rude. We also have to consider the context of our speech. So when it comes to our legal rights, our legal privileges, our legal idea, this big broad idea of free speech, these kinds of things are all legal and protected. And so now we have to think about, like, okay, so what does that mean? Protected from what? What is it that we are protected from? Who are we protected from? That's another really important thing to think about. So just let that marinate for a minute while I sip my tea. So the who and the what are we protected from is very important as we move forward. So hold that thought in your brain. Okay, speech that is not protected includes specific things that fall under the definition of harassment. Language that is deliberately directed to harm others, but there's a very narrow definition of this. So we're talking about things like libel and slander, things that are more than just hurting their feelings, but could incite physical harm to that person, or could harm their career or put them in danger. Another thing that people often think about that is maybe not okay is offensive language. And I put this one up here because offensive language is totally protected. You being insensitive and saying the things that you want to say is technically legally protected speech. However, you do need to think about the other impacts of what it means to be offensive or use offensive language. So for example, while there are no limits to what you can say, being offensive can easily lose you your job or get you in trouble. So it can be filtered. So now we're going to talk a little bit more about what we're protected from, who we're protected from. So let me just, I'm going to actually go back to this one for a second. So when we talk about free speech and this big broad idea of free speech within the United States and other countries, what we're protected from and who we're protected from, we really need to be careful to remember that we are legally protected only from government censorship. That's the only thing that we're protected from. The government, whether it be the federal or the state or an organization operating on behalf of those entities, does not have the authority to prevent you from voting, prevent you from writing things, prevent you from being involved in the community. They don't have the right to stop you from protesting. There are some limitations, obviously, because to have a protest and gather a large number of people, you do have to have the proper permits with the city and the area that you are protesting in. And you also have to consider any limitations that might occur if you are on private property, because that's a whole other set of things. And while the government cannot censor you from being insensitive or expressing yourself without filters, there are a whole host of other people and organizations that can totally censor you. And this is where a lot of frustration occurs. individuals can ask you to stop expressing your free speech. Cities can require you to have a permit in order to have a protest. Businesses and public places can limit what you can say, and your job can limit your free speech. So this is why, like in schools, we can't just say whatever we want. We can't just use whatever language we want. We can't swear in classes. We can't say insensitive things because school is obligatory. We're required to be here and it's a public thing. And since everybody has to be here to a certain extent, we also have to provide a certain amount of protection for all the members of our community. So we can't say hurtful things. Companies, private companies, all of your social media, those are all operated by private companies, and they have every right to restrict what content they allow on their site. You certainly have the freedom to set up your own server and start your own social media thing with your own rules and limitations. And if you want to post, your content on the internet, and you might have to get creative by having your own servers and all the technology that goes along with that. So companies don't have to allow you to express yourself maybe the way that you want. And that's something that is frustrating for a lot of people because they feel like they are being censored. They feel like it's unfair when companies or whatever, censor them or limit their speech. But we have to remember that we are only protected from government censorship. The theory of the marketplace of ideas often comes up. And if you're not familiar with this theory, that's okay. Essentially, the whole idea, part of our ideas of democracy are connected to this theory. So the free marketplace of ideas often is about people coming together and sharing a bunch of ideas. And a lot of times this gets a bit misconstrued, and people start to make the assumption that a free marketplace of ideas means that everybody gets to speak and everybody gets the same amount of time and everybody gets to be heard. But if you read if you do some research about the marketplace of ideas and understand the history behind it and kind of the context of when it was kind of thought of or born or whatever, the marketplace of ideas is a little bit different. In a democracy, the marketplace of ideas is designed to let the best ideas rise. And essentially, it is kind of like, this crazy mob pit of argumentation and ideas and clashing. And it allows people to disagree with one another and say, hey, no, that idea isn't good for our society, or it's just a bad idea, or it's not well thought through. And so we should not allow it to rise to the top. We shouldn't listen to every idea. We should seek for the best ideas. And so that is also another thing that is confusing to some people, because when we start thinking about speech that is not protected, let's even go back to the little quote that I had. There are laws against libel, which is a form of harassment that's very, very narrowly defined. And then anything that incites violence or rebellion would be limited. But other than that, people have a right to express their opinions publicly. But that's the key. The difference between publicly and privately, or what we're really talking about, is the limits of expressing ourselves in an open public forum as contrasted to, in a private business or on a social media that is owned by a private company. And if you read Supreme Court cases dealing with the First Amendment and especially our right to free expression, the Supreme Court definitely wants to allow for the broadest interpretation of free speech, because our core philosophy, and I feel confident in saying this even now, with regards to the Supreme Court, is that we don't want to censor things, because once we start picking and choosing what is acceptable and unacceptable, then you get into a whole messiness of other things. So at a government level, the government doesn't necessarily want to have that censorship. That means that the freedom of speech not only allows individuals to speak out against social injustice, but it also allows individuals to have hate speech and racist speech. And even though we may not like that, it's a very fine line, right? Because what if something I say is suddenly interpreted to be, this kind of speech, and we are censoring this? Like, who gets to decide? So the Supreme Court really wants to have the broadest definition possible with these very, very minor, very narrow definitions of libel and slander under harassment, and then anything that incites violence or rebellion. So this is a really important distinction, because now we're going to take a look at ethical speech. Let me take a sip. Okay, so I know that there's like a ton of ideas swirling in your minds right now. And if we were in class, we would be having like a super amazing discussion about this, but we're not. So you just have to listen to me, and I'm sorry, and you have to look at my, messy house, my messy apartment. So now let's take a look at ethical speech. So ethical speech is not a codified or legal definition. This is more of people's perceptions, okay? So first off, we have to understand what is ethics, first of all. And one little definition that it was really succinct from dictionary.com says, pertaining to or dealing with morals or the principles of morality pertaining to right and wrong in conduct. Now, these are very, very subjective, as I'm sure your mind is already recognizing, because who decides what morals, what's right and wrong? Like, it's very, very, very muddy, right? So here are a couple of examples of ethical speech that people might think about. Treating others with respect might be considered ethical. Expressing yourself without filters, maybe, maybe not. It depends on what your value is, right? Because if your value is honesty, then maybe that's ethical. If you're being, if you're using strong language that might offend that person, that might not be ethical. So let's stay on this slide for a second. So I want you to think about, okay, what are some examples of ethical speech? I sometimes will ask you guys in speech class, I will say, hey, like, let's use professional language in our speeches instead of slang or anything like that. That could be an example of ethical speech. But supporting some social justice might be ethical. And so it gets very, very muddy, right? As a community, we might have some shared understanding of what is acceptable and unacceptable. So generally speaking, I would say in Idaho schools, offensive swear words are not really allowed in school. That would be perhaps an unethical way of exercising our speech. Another example might be in, a public meeting. What kinds of topics are we going to talk about? What kind of the language are we going to use? We often kind of pin it with this idea of respect, right? Ethics and respect go together. But different communities have different ideas of what is considered ethical and unethical. And that can be very, very confusing, because there's just so many definitions. It's so subjective. So now let's move on to some of the core issues, because you guys are going to have a task where you're going to have to really kind of dig into this idea of free expression and ethics and all. Like, you're just going to have, some thinking to do. Okay, you're going to have some thinking to do. So what is the issue? And again, if we were in class, we would be having this excellent dialectic about all of these complicated issues and how confusing it can be for some people. And I mean, especially in the current political climate, we have people, even members of the same family, coming together and totally clashing, partly because of, ideologies, or, whether they agree or disagree with a politician or a policy, but some because of this idea of free speech. Even when we look at symbols in our culture, in our history, very recently we've had a lot of discussion and a lot of debate about symbols such as the Confederate flag and statues of Southern generals. And this has created a lot of confusion and fervor, because on one hand, people want to say, this is my freedom of expression. Other people maybe are disagreeing. Maybe they're seeing the symbols in different ways based upon different types of context. And then how do we kind of come together and reconcile that, right? Sorry, I had an itch. So it can be really, really messy. It can also be really, really relevant to what we are experiencing, right? Because we also have the risk of lots of misinformation. So let's take a look at some. Let me give you another quick example before I turn over to the task. So the issue is there's a lot of confusion about free speech. There's a lot of misunderstanding about free speech. A lot of people don't really realize, or maybe they forget or don't understand, that private individuals and private companies can censor all they want. This also has a flip side, because we are seeing so much misinformation on the internet these days, and even from news. Like, how do you even know who to listen to, or who has credibility, or what information or what statistics are accurate? Because we have to make real decisions for our lives. We have to decide whether or not to, go to, our friend's party with a bunch of other people, or to go to the comedy club or the concert if there happens to be one. We have to decide whether or not to wear a mask. We need information. We need accurate information. And it's so, so confusing because there's so much misinformation. And because we are protecting all of this speech, which is good, it is good, even though it's hard, it is good. And I think that it's very important to remember that it's for a good reason. We also have to learn how to filter those things. We have to learn how to navigate the messiness of the swamp. And who are we going to listen to? Who has credibility? One of the things that I've really been trying to do is speak less and listen more, because part of our free speech is also really listening. And I'm not saying listen to every issue, because again, marketplace of ideas, but I'm currently just really trying to engage in the humanity of people. And listening is a big part of that. So now we're going to go to your very first task in this particular little segment of tasks. Your first task is to write a 2 to 4 page double-spaced typed essay. Everything you turn into me is going to be double-spaced and typed. That explores the complexity of free speech. So this task is going to be sort of the initial investigation into a bigger project all about free speech. We are going to be developing a bigger presentation about issues with free speech. And just, I think the more educated we can become about free speech and all the complexities of it, the better we will be at exercising our free speech and responding when other people exercise their free speech. So let me give you a few more details. Okay, so you're going to consider some following questions as you write this essay. And this is a pretty broad essay, all right? So first you might want to consider what are the differences between free speech and ethical speech, which we've talked a lot about today. So please feel free to refer back to this video. Then, could ethical speech conflict with free speech? That's a big one, okay? What role do ethics play in communication in general? We kind of talked about those community standards. And does the harm from hate speech lead to restricting the freedom of speech? These are some big questions to kind of wrestle with. You don't have to answer all of these questions, but I would really encourage you to maybe choose one or two to kind of guide your research and your paper. And I also want you to provide examples of ethical communication, and free speech in general that relate to your research. These questions and this task is posted or will be posted for you on ManageBac and Google Classroom. And you'll have a little bit of time to really think about this. And we will talk about this more on Wednesday when I see you again. You guys, as always, are awesome. Thank you for sticking it out with me in this little video. I hate doing this, like just me speaking and you not interacting. So hopefully I'll be able to come up with some little interactive piece by Monday that you guys can do, like a Flipgrid or, what is the little pinboard thing? I can't think of it right now, but
Padlet.
A Padlet, thank you. Yes, a Padlet. So maybe I'll come up with something like that where you guys can sort of just, share your thoughts. One last thing that I will say as we move into this topic is within the confines of our class, it's really important to me that you guys are open-minded, that we do not participate in being offensive, that we critically think about one another's ideas as we navigate the messiness of free speech, even if we disagree, especially when we disagree. We can totally disagree respectfully without being rude or offensive, because this is a complex issue and a complex topic, and there are so many opinions and ideas that are all valid, and I want you guys to know that that's important to me, that I value you, I value your thoughts and opinions, and also just be open to the possibility of having your mind changed. That is totally okay. We are learners, we are thinkers, we are inquirers, and if your mind isn't being changed, then you're probably not doing the work to really dig deep, at least a little bit. So consider those things. Please email me if you have questions. I will be available by email, and I will be back live tomorrow. I know we don't have class tomorrow, but I will be live tomorrow. So if you guys do need to have like a one-on-one Zoom, I can set that up for you on Tuesday after our regular classes, and that's not a problem. So please feel free to email me. And yeah, I look forward to reading your essays all about free speech. Thanks. Bye, everybody. Let me stop sharing and then I'll pause. There we go.